be able to see it, and it's just like so impressive to see that stuff, and it's cool to be able to see that. So yeah, yeah, Patsy. Right.
Yeah, it was just amazing how much gold there was around there.
Yeah. That reminds me of like I you all may know, like in Dubai and that area in the Middle East, they have a lot of money from like oil and stuff, and they actually had gold vending machines there, and it was nothing like what we're talking about here in Solomon's time as far as how prosperous they were, but it like blew me away. They had like gold vending machines. When I pulled out Uber, they had an Uber helicopter that you could get to take you different places, and so I feel like that's the closest I've ever been to like what they were probably experiencing at this time. But Solomon's wealth was way more vast than even what they have over there. But yeah, it's just really impressive, and like people want to see it. So, any other thoughts before we get into the passage?
Yeah. Trade also.
Yeah.
He did trade with the countries all over the region.
Right.
And so they would have known about the wealth by the things that he was buying, the imports.
Yep. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's like an important part of some of what we'll even be discussing today is like how do you balance like the trade and what you do with the nations around you without or with trying not to be drawn away or like being so focused on your wealth. So, okay, let's jump in. If somebody wants to read 2 Chronicles 9 verses 1 through 6 for me.
Now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with hard questions, having a very great retinue. Camels that bore spices, gold in abundance, and precious stones. When she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he could not explain it to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and their apparel, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe their words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half of the greatness of your wisdom was not told me. You exceed the fame of which I heard."
All right, thank you. So, we see here kind of what we already alluded to. Like, we have the Queen of Sheba. She's heard of the fame of Solomon, and, she wants to come and see it for herself. Everything I could find, like, said this is where, like, modern-day Yemen, which I also didn't know where that was, people generally agreed, like, 1,200 to 1,500-mile trip. I think the important part I take away from that is, like, this was a long journey for her, right? This wasn't just, like, popping over, like, a day's journey to like see this. This was a long journey that would have taken her a lot of time. And as we get into like what she brings as a tribute, it wasn't just like it was just her, right? So like this was a somewhat of a procession, and would have not been something she just did on a whim, right? This was a planned trip. So I think that's important for us to know. But I also wanted to read. We've talked about how we've kind of been studying out of Second Chronicles, some from First Kings, but there's generally parallel accounts for these things. So I just wanted to read to you all something that wasn't called out in Second Chronicles that I thought was interesting in First Kings chapter 10, just verse 1. It says, "Now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions." And I think that's important because, like, she was recognizing that, like, God had blessed, like she was recognizing the Lord as far as part of why she was coming here, which I thought was an interesting thing to mention as far as we go through the study today. Like, Second Chronicles, because it is a chronicle of what happened, almost seems to focus more on the fact like Solomon answered her questions and talking about Solomon building the temple. But as we've discussed in previous weeks, it wasn't just Solomon, right? Like, one, he had physical helpers that helped him accomplish this, but this was all blessings from God because he'd asked for wisdom and done what he was supposed to. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind as we think about Sheba coming over to learn about this. So what was she impressed by? Now that we've actually read it, what were some of the things in the verses 3 through 5 that she was impressed by?
Other material things.
Yeah, a lot of material things. And I thought we could just keep a mental list going as we talk through this of like what we tend to be impressed by too. Like we also tend to look around, see people's material possessions and things, cars they drive, houses they have, boats, whatever the case may be. Like we take notice of that today and are often impressed by what other people have around us. So that's a good one. What else is she impressed by? His wisdom, right? And I think that I feel like sometimes we stray a little bit away from wisdom and focus more on knowledge today, but in that same thing, like we will respect people more who have lots of knowledge and have lots of learning, and look to them. So I think that's still something that applies to us today. Any other things that stand out to people that she recognized?
Well, she said she was impressed with the way his servants were there, And I always think about that now, when you go someplace and you see that there's always different people working there, you wonder why there's, And down here at this Culver's, there's always the same people working there.
Yeah.
So he must be a really good boss,
Right.
And so.
Well, that's a good point that I wanted to hit on as far as we might lump the servants under just the wealth aspect, right? But I think it's slightly different in the sense that just like you're saying, when you actually recognize the servers or the servants as the people they are, what they're wearing, what they're doing, it goes to show how Solomon was probably a good leader and treated them decent, as well as they were passionate about what they were doing, right? It'd be very easy to be compelled to service in this regard and not provide good service, right? But if this stood out to a queen who in theory had her own wealth and her own servants, this means it was pretty impressive, which is something for us to keep in mind, as we study through this. And then we go on down through here, and we already hit on this in verse 5, how she had heard, reports about Solomon's words and wisdom, but she didn't believe it until she had actually come to see it, right? And we can definitely understand that, right? There's things that we even might see today in pictures with the technology that we have that we just don't we're how could that even be possible, right? And she hadn't even seen pictures, it just would have been word of mouth, right? And so needing to come and verify this for herself, definitely makes sense there. And it wasn't even as great as what she had been told. So I think that's, just so amazing. Like we've talked about the past couple of weeks when we talked about the building of the temple and all the things that God helped Solomon accomplish. Part of the reasons that the temple was dedicated was so that people would recognize the power of God. And part of the reason for this is so she will recognize the power that God has and what he's blessed Solomon and the people of Jerusalem with. Now, to take a second to think about us today, I don't think many of us are in the position where we can be let's bring people who aren't Christians back to our house and show off what all we have and that God has blessed us with this in order to, motivate them to listen to us. So what do we do today in this regard to proclaim Jesus to people?
I was going to say, as far as the people and Solomon was concerned, the people generally had respect for him. Mm-hmm. He was very wealthy, but he did good with his money.
Yeah.
And obviously his servants also respected him. They weren't working under fear.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a good thought for us to take away, whether we're leading a group of people or even if we're just paying one person to work for us, that relationship is important, where it's not out of fear or force, if we can make it not be that way, right? It's out of respect and there's a good relationship there. Yeah, Juanita?
And watch your every step, because those around you are watching.
Right.
And it doesn't do any good to tell them something and then see you not live it.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, Solomon's going to get in. If we get to that today, Solomon's literally in the next chapter going to make mistakes as far as how he goes about and does things, to the point of it doesn't do you any good to do all of this stuff and then turn around and like the next day you cannot accomplish so much that you can't make mistakes and fall, right? Like just because you get to a certain point, whether you're young or old, it doesn't mean that the next day that Satan can't tempt you or you can do things that you shouldn't. So that's important for us to keep in mind. So any thoughts on the like how we can show to others that the Lord has like blessed us or what he's given us, since we like, I don't even think it would be good if I had like millions of dollars to use that today as my way to be like, come follow Jesus because you will also be blessed with millions of dollars, right? Because that's not what we're told. So how do we embody this same attitude today?
Recognize that these blessings come from God,
Yep.
and we can share that with others, about what you have or whatever that you've been blessed.
Right. Yeah, and I think like it's important for us to remember that today we are not guaranteed that that's going to be like earthly treasures, right? Like the things we are blessed by. Like I may be a Christian who has the right heart for the majority of my life. I still make mistakes, but I'm doing what's right. Like I'm trying to be like David, a man after God's own heart. That doesn't mean that my bank account's going to be full or that I have everything. Like the blessings that we have today are more focused around like the joy and the peace and the fellowship that we have even with one another. And so, but those are still things that people are looking for in the world today that we can talk about and that like we are given. So I think that's a really good point for us to keep in mind. Any other thoughts before we move on? All right, let's read, if somebody can read verses 7 through 12 for me.
Your men, and happy are these servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on his throne to be king for the Lord your God, because your God has loved Israel to establish them forever. Therefore he made you king over them to do justice and righteousness. And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great abundance, and precious stones. There never were any spices such as those that the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Also the servants of Hiram and the servants of Solomon who brought gold from Ophir, algum wood and precious stones, and the king made walkways of the algum wood for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also harps and stringed instruments for singers, and there were none such as these seen before in the land of Judah. Now King Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, much more than she had brought to the king. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants.
All right, thank you. So we kind of hit on the first couple verses already, talking about like how happy are the men and the servants who continually are before you and hear your wisdom. But I think this gives us like specific insight. We were talking about Solomon being a good leader and like respecting people, but it's also specifically called out here that by being in close proximity to him, they would have been hearing this wisdom and like, learning from it, but also it benefiting their lives. And so I think we see a specific example of like something that we can do today if we have wisdom or experience from things that we have, lived in our lives. Like we can share that with those around us, and it's going to be a blessing to them, to help them out, rather than just always looking at like the people around us that maybe younger than us, maybe less experienced, and saying like, oh, I don't know why they make these mistakes or why they don't understand how the world works. Well, we've all been there, and we all still end up in that position no matter how old we are. But like the more experience you have, the more you can share with others. And the Queen of Sheba like goes on to recognize the Lord your God in verse 8, who delighted in you, recognizing that like God set Solomon on the throne. And so, I mean, she's probably heard the reports of this, like we said, but we can also take from this that Solomon didn't like sit her down and say, look at what all I did, right? He didn't go like, this is all me. If she's recognizing God, then he had to also recognize what God had done for him and how he had blessed him, which I think, echoes what we were talking about earlier of how important it is for us when we have blessings and people ask, if we have opportunities where they ask us like, how are you so at peace, or how do you have joy, or whatever the blessings they might ask us are. It's not, us natively, like we might have learned things or experienced things, but it's what God gives to us. So I think it's important to like pass that recognition on to him, and we can look to Solomon's example for that. Why, just a couple like thought questions here too, why in verse 9 do you think she gives tribute or gives this stuff to King Solomon, considering what we've discussed the past couple chapters about how much Solomon has? Does he need what she gives him? Probably not.
It's probably a thank you.
Okay, yeah. Like recognizing like, you let me come in, you showed off everything, because like the thought that's going in the back of my head too is like there's some slight, I don't know if this specifically turns out to be dangerous for like Jerusalem, like maybe it leads to some of the stuff we'll talk about, but like when you bring someone in who's powerful and say, look at what all I have, it can go like this, like we're told, or it can go, oh, I now know what all you have that I want to take, and I'm going to come, by force, or like try to ally with nations around you to like take you over. And so like that's, maybe I'm just too cynical or paranoid, but that's like what's going through my head is like all this is happening is like, oh yeah, we're taking account of the fact that you have this much gold and this much resources and stuff, and like that's a worry for me. But like I think it is interesting that she chooses to like give this to him, like, which seems to me is like a show of goodwill and thankfulness. Yeah.
Abraham, though, and all of the Old Testament like that, anywhere they went, they always took something to whomever they were going to show their gratitude, I think. And I think that was custom to do all those kinds of things. Now, what she had and she brought was, expensive, but
Right. Yeah.
still, I think that's what they did. I mean, even Solomon gave to other kings that he, bargained with in that.
Right. And it just like, even from a practical sense, when there is an exchanging of things, even if we like give gifts to each other today, sometimes it isn't like, oh, I need this or this will make my life better, but it just shows that gratitude back and forth. Even if we like have a card, or like if you give somebody a cookie or a donut, right? Like that can help. You just have a better relationship with them, even though that's not like a huge thing. They probably didn't need that donut. That probably wasn't a huge sacrifice on your part, or whatever the case may be. But I think that typically makes the relationship more favorable than if you didn't give them a donut. So, yeah.
Moved here, the gentleman who moved me in, I had snacks out on the
Yeah.
counter for them, and I said, help yourself to this. They worked really hard for me and
Yeah.
took things, they probably went above and beyond,
Right.
just because, and it wasn't anything for me to really do that.
Right.
Except that I appreciated what they did.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
This diplomacy is still carried on today. I mean, the White House gives gifts all the time. I've read, they even have a room where they just put gifts because no one's allowed to keep them. So the diplomacy of bringing a gift or taking a gift, and you bring your best, and of course she would not show up with something trivial.
Right.
She had to show him, I too have power and riches. But it's still a diplomacy that for whatever reason, has carried on through centuries.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And she was from a different part of the country, and there was different things there that she had that he probably, like the spices, it
Right.
said those were the kind of spices that he didn't have.
Yeah.
So she was, she had things that she had that he probably didn't have, even though he had a lot of things.
Right.
So,
And I mean, like we see that carried on throughout history of like the trade routes that we see in the like 13, 14, 1500s of like the spices that were available in certain areas that weren't available to other, people. And so like that's a good point that I kind of glossed over. There was some stuff that Solomon didn't necessarily have access to that she was able to bring. And like that's always a treat too, right? If you go travel somewhere where that there's something eclectic or whatever that you can bring back, people really appreciate that. Yeah.
You take cheese, right?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Verse 6 that says the one who is taught the word is to share all good things with the one who teaches. And so when we went to Europe, we brought chunks of cheese encased in wax for all the preachers along the way.
Yeah.
And I packed that in a little insulated diaper bag. And before the trip, I threw my shortwave radio in there.
Uh-huh.
I got special attention at all the security points. That looked very suspicious, but it was like bringing something from Wisconsin.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Those are the things we deal with today. They would have had to. They probably didn't have the checkpoints and stuff, but she would have had to like carry all this stuff with her and things like that. So it's interesting to think about some of the similarities and differences. So I think those are all like good points for us to keep in mind. Let's keep going just for the sake of time. I'm going to read this since it's a lengthy passage, but try to follow along with me. We'll be in 2 Chronicles 9:13 through 28. And it says, the weight of gold that came to Solomon's yearly was 666 talents of gold, besides what the traveling merchants and traders brought, and all the kings of Arabia and governors of the country brought gold and silver to Solomon. And King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of hammered gold went into each shield. He also made 300 shields of hammered gold. 300 shekels of gold went into each shield. The king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps with a footstool of gold, which were fastened to the throne. There were armrests on either side of the place of the seat, and the 2 lions stood beside the armrest. 12 lions stood there, one on each side of the steps. Nothing like this had been made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. For the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the merchant ships came, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. And all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules at a set rate year by year. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots and 12,000 horsemen whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king at Jerusalem. So he reigned over all the kings from the river to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees as abundant as the sycamores which are in the lowland. And they brought horses to Solomon from Egypt and from all the lands. All right. To me, I don't know, as I was reading through this, like studying for this, I was just thinking of like that Aladdin song where it's like Prince Ali and they go through all the stuff and he's like marching in with all the like camels and elephants and all that stuff. And like that's what this makes me think of, is like Solomon's wealth was even so much more vast than that. But that's the like closest thing in my mind that I can picture of like this parade of like all the things going on. We even like in verse 13, we just see, when I was like looking at the like exchange rate and inflation and all that like Solomon's yearly salary or whatever, 666 talents of gold would be like in the hundreds of millions of dollars today. It's like what people guess at. Like it was just insane how much wealth there was. I don't want to get distracted by this point, but I also thought it was very interesting that this specifically was the number 666. I don't want to dive off into that, but just something for you all to think about is like maybe potential foreshadowing for what's to come. But it was very interesting that it was that specific number. But we just see all the things and like a summary of how glorious it was and how much God had blessed Solomon here. So, we kind of read through all those things. There's some other things to call out just as far as like I thought it was interesting how the mention of like there was so much gold that nothing was silver because there was so much gold, and silver was just so common that like it wasn't even special at that point, right? It was like, oh, you've got silver. Well, there's so much gold here, there's so much silver, it doesn't matter. And I just cannot imagine like experiencing that amount of wealth. And like, it's probably for all time going to be like the wealthiest, like a king or the group of people like we see here. Solomon had surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. But like, this is where to me we start to see like some problems develop, but they're not specifically mentioned here. But as I was like looking through this and studying for it, I wanted to read, if you'll turn over with me to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, where even some of the things that might be easy to gloss over here are actually problematic and can lead to some of what happens to Solomon. So if you want to join me in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. And it says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as a king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book of a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. And I just thought, if we start with like the second half of what we read in Deuteronomy, I thought it was so impressive, that like the king will be required to write the book of law so that he knows it, right? And that's approved by the Levitical priest. So if Solomon followed this, which, we would think he did because he was doing the right things when he started out as king, he knows the law. But what are some things that we read about in Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 17 that are problematic with what we just read about in 2 Chronicles? Horses, women, gold. Yeah.
And silver.
And silver. He is. So, and like, I wanted to we don't have to spend the rest of the time just thinking about this thought, but I wanted to like think about, if we're Solomon, how do we balance that God has blessed us with all of these things with what he knows from the old law, right? Because some of this reads like, oh, if we just gloss over 2 Chronicles, like, well, God gave this to him, but is that what actually happened here? So what are people's thoughts on like how we balance the two passages we just read? Yeah.
That God didn't give him the horses, he was training
Yep.
the horses. So they didn't just gallop into his area.
Right. They're just like, oh, we're gonna direct you here. And I think Jesse had mentioned this at the start of like thinking about the trade that went on and the things that he did. As far as I can tell, there was nothing specifically wrong with trading as a whole, right? Like for him to like interact with other nations around him. But God had given specific direction on like what was allowed to be exchanged, what he was allowed to do as far as what his focuses were on, and like he did not follow that. So yeah, Jesse.
And he went to Egypt, which was specifically for him.
Right, and didn't he even marry like his first wife was Egyptian? So we have all these things that were warned against that Solomon should have known, because if he did what was said in Deuteronomy from the beginning, he's written this. He's written these words down so that he has a copy of them, and he proceeds to not do this. So, I mean, I think we can think today, like, one, we know what's written for us in God's word and what we're supposed to do, and, there are times when we don't do it, but how much harder would it be if we think about when times are going really good for us, right? Like when we're having good times in life, if we had all this wealth, all this fame, and we feel like I've got God's backing, he's blessing me with this. How do we keep from like ending up like Solomon, where we think like we've got all this stuff, I've got all this backing, and not go the direction he did, and instead like stay strong in the Lord and stay focused on what we should be doing? Yeah.
Choices to make.
Yeah.
God gives you that ability. He'll bless you and give you, but then other things come to you, that he allows, not
Yeah.
necessarily that he's saying it's okay, but he gives you a choice to say, oh yeah, I'm gonna take that, or I better, stay away, or whatever with it, or give it this way, or do that, or
Yeah.
however.
And it's like, I think to your point, we hit on this the last week or the week before of like, just like God is like wanting us to succeed and blessing us so that we can do that, we've also got Satan that is trying to work against us while all this is happening. And how happy do you think he is when he can take us when we're like in a place of prominence where we're feeling good about ourselves and like slowly direct us in the wrong path, right? But we are given choices every day. And so I think that's why like it's so important, like when I find myself like feeling like, like I know enough about the Bible, or I know enough about whatever topic, that maybe I don't need to study as much or think about it every day or whatever, like that's when you're going to make a mistake because it's not in the forefront of your mind. So it's important for us to like meditate on the things that we learn and like keep that in the forefront of our mind. So, yeah.
Well, basically, we need to remember that it's not ours. It's on loan to us. It's
Yeah.
a gift from God.
Yeah.
And treated as such always.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
It's too, we have to remember, it's not wrong, let's say, to be rich.
Right.
It's, and to give to your family and things like that because God has allowed you to accumulate that. But it's the way that you use what God has given you too. I mean, if you're really rich and you're selfish with everything you do and stuff like that, that's going to go against you. But, over the years, we've known several people who have been extremely rich and Christians, and they do so much good, behind the scenes without anybody really knowing. And some people look at it and say, well, how come he gets all of this now?
Right.
They don't realize what they do behind the scenes sometimes too. So, we have to look at that too. It's okay to have riches.
Right, because I mean, like, for the basic riches that Solomon has, right, like, God did bless him with that, right? Like, so, like you're saying, there's nothing directly wrong with that. It's when we start to, like, because we have so much, we're like, I want even more stuff, and I'm going to be so focused on that I'm not doing what I need to do for God. So, yeah, John.
Another way to look at this also, I'm pretty confident that Solomon did not set out when he was the young king to say, I'm gonna accumulate 1,000 women and do all these things that the law has said not for me to do.
Yeah.
But it was a series of very gradual steps. And at every step, he rationalized. The horses in his world were like accumulating tanks today for the military. It was a tactical, it was part of their weapon system for chariots, etc. And so, we'll be more secure, and I'll get these horses, and we'll be more secure. And they'll do this, and we'll be better off. And you start to make these gradual choices, and we do that all the time, as human beings.
Right, because I mean, the part of the reason that God didn't want them to like accumulate all these things is like it takes away from God being able to show his power to protect them, right? Like if they, in our terms today, it'd be the difference, like you mentioned, of like if we didn't have any of the U.S. military and like God was directly doing like he did back then, like it would make us depend on him much more if we're like, well, we got to stay faithful to God to have protection versus like depending on ourselves and stuff like that. So I think that's, a good point. And like about the gradual decision points, you're exactly right. Like we even see some of that start to like unfold here, right? Like of like when he married the Egyptian woman for like that relationship, right? Like he didn't at that moment say, oh, 1,000 wives now. It was like, here's this one thing, but we can see how that number would have grown for various reasons. So I think that's a good point too. Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of piggyback off that point. point, and I'm not sure if this goes that deep, but I found it like a weird paradox that someone that was so wise couldn't follow like such simple instructions laid out. And I'm not sure if there's like some more subtext around that, but I don't know. It's just an observation.
I mean, to me, like, I don't know of anything, and like other people can chime in if there's like more direct things from the text or, parallel passages that I'm missing. But I think that like is a really good point to bring up, and that like it's very, we get so confident in ourselves, and it would be so easy when you've got the world's leaders coming for your wisdom to be like, I know this, God has blessed me with this wisdom so I can make my own decisions. And you start to forget the basic prescriptive things that God said for a specific reason, because you're like, I've made all these decisions for all these powerful people. Like, surely I can decide that it's okay to have some chariots, or it's okay to do whatever. And I think that's like such a practical thing for us today, is like we can be like, well, I've weathered this storm. I've weathered these 3 storms. I've helped people come to Jesus. I've done all these great things. But no matter what your age or experience level or spiritual maturity, we can always mess up. Like, it's just that next day when that choice comes to you and you make that wrong choice, and then you make the next wrong choice, and you can be, in a bad place no matter how wise you were or whatever you had. So I think that's important for us all to keep in mind. Yeah, Patsy?
He did build her a house away from the temple, though, because he thought, that was his, I guess he felt like that would at least do something.
Yeah, and I mean, that's similar to how we rationalize things today, right? It's like, well, I've got my church life and I've got my, work life, or whatever the case may be. These are separate, so I'm not hurting anybody, or whatever, however we might rationalize any of the various things that we do. But, yeah.
Well, that's all I do.
Yeah.
She had one bad habit, and that was all she did.
Right.
And the last one,
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think it is such an easy thing to find ourselves like looking around at other people around us and say, well, I just have this one sinful thing that I'm doing, but him over here, or Josh up there, he's like sinning like crazy. Like, I'm way better than that, and so, but I think like it sounds absurd when I say it, but how many times do we do that, right? We're like, well, I'm here and I'm coming to church on Sunday, and like, look at these people in the world around me. I'm like doing way better than them. So like, why is this one thing I'm doing so bad? But I think like that's so easy for us to fall in that trap. Yeah.
Your original question of what should we do, and it's make a sticky note out of what these statutes in Deuteronomy said, and then maybe Solomon wouldn't have done it.
Right. Well, like that. Like, but it's what's funny to me, and this kind of gets to your point, is like God even knew this was going to be a problem. He said, as a king, you need to write this down and have a copy. There's no excuse. You have your own copy. You can reference it at any time. But guess what? Today, I think I have technically 3 copies of 2nd Chronicles up here with me right now, and I still make mistakes based on things that I should know, and so like we do it today as well, right? Because like it's one thing to know it, and we should keep it in our minds, but we also have to like let it change our lives and change our heart, or it doesn't matter. Karen, I think you had some.
Say, we have to remember God knows what's in our heart.
Yeah.
No matter how we can express something, He knows whether it's a true feeling of the heart or whether it's just play acting.
Right. Yeah. And like He's going to be able to discern that. And we could fool everybody else in the whole world, and like He knows what's going on in our heart. And like something that I wanted to mention real quick, we won't actually get to read the verses about the wives and the different things that Solomon gets into, but I thought it was interesting too, of like, I think for us, we look at, things like, oh, I would like more money, or I would like more of whatever thing. And, you can go read the book of Ecclesiastes and like read what Solomon writes about like his experiences. But Solomon had more wealth than anyone, right? Than anyone will probably ever have. And like, he still needed to go find fulfillment in his mind in other things, right? Like, well, I need to have more wives than anybody else because that shows political power. I need to have more of X, Y, or Z than everybody else. So it isn't something where we can say, oh, I'll focus on God once I have this, once I have what I'm striving for, right? Like, if we don't learn how to curb that, we're just going to go on to the next thing and need more of that, even if we accumulated all of whatever we're striving for. Yeah, Bill.
Well, I find myself thinking back and what people had to do in the past was rely, further back you go, rely on your mind for knowledge, to retain knowledge.
Yeah.
You didn't have all kinds of access easy for you to get at, the
Yeah.
way people were spread out. But now I find myself not really taking things into my mind because I got Alexis and I got Google.
Right.
All I have to do is sit there and ask Google, you know, this and that, it's right there.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I've had the exact thought of, like, why do I need to, like, memorize or learn this? Because it's 3 seconds away for me to go and Google it, right? But there is a very direct, practical opposition to that is if I need that to, like, be in my heart and changing me, it can't be, Google is not going to, like, come into me and, like, change me, right? Yeah, or a power outage. But, like, if it's not, you know, if we don't know what God wants for us and what he's told us to do, then it's not going to, like, change our lives, especially if we're not focusing on it, dwelling on it, and thinking about that. So I think that's a really good point. We're a little bit over. Any last minute comments before we close on David and Solomon? All right. If not, thanks for bearing with me on all the classes and stuff, and we'll get ready for worship.